Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Powerful Management Metrics to Drive Effective Behaviors and Generate Exceptional Business Results. I'm your host, Diana Davis, editor of PEXNetwork.com. The famous Peter Drucker quote, "What gets measured gets managed," guides so much of business thinking today. Businesses use key performance indicators to keep an eye on what's going on in the organization and make sure that things are on track. But are you using the right set of metrics and techniques to drive the kind of behaviors that will get you the best results? Well, if that's something that you've ever asked yourself, you've come to the right place today. We've got three fantastic presenters lined up for today's webinar, all with a long list of credentials and practical experience. First up, we have Eric Sharp, Director of Active Operations Management. Eric is an accomplished strategist, consultant, and solutions specialist who for the past 25 years has worked within major corporations on finding both technology and non-technology enhancements that help drive productivity improvements. Presenting alongside Eric, we also have Neil Bentley, Joint Founder and Managing Director of AOM International. He started work in Lucas Industries, gaining experience in manufacturing production management before focusing on financial services and the public sector, first with PA Consulting Group and then as a partner with Specialist Consultants OCP. Since launching AOM with Richard Jeffrey in 2005, he has overseen double-digit growth every year, expansion across 5 continents, and the acquisition of a string of prestigious clients working in over 30 countries. And finally, we have Fotios Saratziotis, Director of Operations at National Bank of Canada, where he is responsible for mutual fund operations and operational support centers that service proprietary dealers as well as external dealers that clear through National Bank. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Eric.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome to those of you joining us today as we delve into the area of metrics in a way that is not typically discussed. Our objective today is to show why KPIs and quotas can be counterproductive, to provide firsthand insight into one company's rethinking of their approach and how metrics affected them. We'll also discuss how you can achieve a paradigm shift, and we'll leave you with the enlightenment that the magnitude of improvement we're going to discuss is not only possible, but being achieved daily. We'll jump into the meat of this session in a second, but I thought I'd provide you a high-level overview of today's agenda. We'll discuss a perspective on quotas, task, employee performance, and how the metrics tied to these everyday items within service operations might create challenges rather than rewards. We'll be joined by Neil Bentley, co-founder of AOM International, who will discuss the idea that what gets measured gets manipulated. And then we'll discuss the details behind shifting the paradigm and the results available from doing so. We'll then take a deeper dive with Fotios Saratziotis of National Bank of Canada, who will share firsthand how this paradigm shift impacted his organization. And we'll then recap, discuss the empowerment available to your organization with this approach, and then we'll wrap things up. So, that being said, off we go. You might have seen us promoting this webinar with a pretty well-known quote from Peter Drucker, the business author, who said, "What gets measured gets managed." And that rings true in what we're going to discuss today. The same is also true that a current set of KPIs can hide a lot of unproductive busy work. The results of this are organizations become reactive instead of proactive, driven by an unrecognized variability in effort required. Dealing with lack of control, there's no allowance for backlogs, and the scariest part, which is the business is operating by staffing to peak or at least close to it. Combined, these all contribute to quota-based operations providing incremental change, but not transformational change. As we continue through this presentation, we'll break down the pieces and show how a paradigm shift can create the transformational change that every organization needs to be competitive in today's economy. And by the way, we do understand that old habits are hard to break. For instance, if you were taught as a child to butter your bread with a fork, you'd probably find that a hard habit to break until you finally realized or were taught that a knife would accomplish the job much better. Now, it's not to say you wouldn't accomplish it with the fork, but just because you were taught what many would argue is the less productive way to accomplish your goal doesn't mean you should continue to do it that way. So let's get to the details, and you'll understand this much better. It's our experience that a lot of existing metrics are based on absolute numbers. So let's take a minute and discuss the concept of absolute in terms of individuals. Absolute is literally defined means that you're not qualified or it's diminished in any way. It's total. An individual quota, which is one type of KPI, might say you need to complete X number of claims, loans, whatever the widget might be, in X amount of time. As a manager, if you implement an absolute number, aren't you sending the message that once that number is achieved, the staff is done? This is true because there's no incentive to do more than the quota. In fact, staff are often not wishing to exceed their quota for fear that the quota will be increased. In other words, you're self-limiting the organization. Look at this half-filled glass. The question should be, where can I find the rest that I need to fill it? Now, we'll come back to this thought a little bit later. Okay. Take a look at this idea of absolutes with respect to staffing. Most organizations take on staff based on what they anticipate their average volumes will be at the busiest time of their year. The chances are that the staffing levels will have also been set to allow for sickness, vacations, and other potential shrinkage factors. This is what we would call just-in-case resourcing. So at this point, I'm going to ask Neil Bentley, the co-founder of Active Operations Management International, to shed a bit more perspective on this just-in-case approach. Neil?
Thanks, Eric. This idea of just in case was something I first came across when I was responsible for introducing Toyota production methods in the automotive industry. Although the idea was to make components to a just-in-time schedule, quite often the factory supervisor would try and keep a supply of additional components just in case something went wrong. And this idea has stuck with me, and we now see in the world of service operations management just-in-case staffing. And the idea of just in case in this context is it could be just in case we get more work than we forecast, or just in case work is more complex than normal, or just in case there's higher staff absence than anticipated, and so on. But if we do apply just in case resourcing, where average levels of staff are pushed into a variable work demand, then we will get fluctuating productivity, as the team has to work more or less hard to get the work complete. Now, if we compare this fluctuating productivity with a more stable state that can be achieved by better coordination of resource, then we can see some of the classic operational problems that have often been highlighted by lean practitioners. And Eric, I know how much lean practitioners like their Japanese buzzwords, so I've just included some of them here. And I guess MUDA is the one that most people have heard of. MUDA is the idea of waste. And quite often, lean practitioners will talk about the waste of overproduction. But what we're seeing here is the waste of over-resourcing, where we've got more resource than we need, just at this particular time. But then there's also MURI, or overburden, which is caused by having more work than resource. And obviously that can affect quality or service or whatever. And then MURA, which is just inconsistency, that fluctuating productivity. And actually, it's this inconsistency which probably causes most problems in operations. It causes stress, uncertainty, difficulties with planning, and so on.
I appreciate that explanation, Neil. That was great, and we'll come back to you shortly for a little bit more. Let's take another look, though, at what Neil was just discussing. This diagram illustrates when work-in is higher than anticipated, there's a push for increased output and often overtime, which has a negative impact on quality and cost. Conversely, when volumes miss expectations, the cost per unit increases and staff are unable to deliver on quota since the work is not there. So the risks to quality, service, employee satisfaction, and cost with traditional approaches are in fact a reality. The other variable in this is that quotas often assume an equal skill level of individuals and also no variability in the task itself. And an example would be when processing a loan or claim request, where either one of those would not be necessarily the same to complete. And one might be a complete form, a loan or a claim that are done, and the process goes quickly, and one might require some research. All tasks are not equal, even though a quota might effectively assume that. So the variability for both skill and task complexity exacerbates goal setting and meeting expectations. Let's dig a bit deeper into what we're talking about. What you're looking at is a typical team environment with full-time, part-time, and temporary staff. Those staff generally have some standard quota assigned. As we mentioned earlier, traditional quota-based approaches often staff to peak, or at least closer to peak than not. Now, this is due to the fact that resources will expect to be able to hit their quota within certain challengeable limits. So while this meets the customer SLA, it does nothing to really control costs and is further diluted when taking volume fluctuations into account. So just to get a pulse on reality, let's bring in Fotios Saratziotis from National Bank. Fotios, would you agree that the largest pockets of your organization have been staffed close to peak in the past?
Yes, Eric. Historically, most areas would be staffed to deal with the average or peak volume. For many departments, there is seasonal volume that can be 30 or 50% higher compared to the non-seasonal period, and there's a tendency to staff close to that peak to ensure that you meet your SLAs. Because of the lack of information in this regard, we of course didn't think that any area was staffed to peak, but with the new tools, after implementing the methodology, we had a better view of that, and we had better metrics to discern which areas were staffed to peak and which areas were under or overstaffed in general.
Great. Thanks, Fotios. So a couple of facts here. The first fact is that volumes are unpredictable. When organizations staff close to peak while also implementing individual quotas, it creates unbalanced cost, not to mention an unrealistic environment. So how do you deal with this? Well, fact number 2, when volumes exceed staff capabilities, overtime is required to cover the shortfall. Put in other way, excess capacity drives waste, which ultimately drives increased cost. And the final fact is that missed workload means individual quotas are missed, resulting in a missed reward through no fault of their own. Now, I think this is the perfect spot to bring Neil Bentley back into the discussion to discuss how in many cases what gets measured can also be manipulated. Neil, would you like to explain this a bit further?
Yeah, sure, Eric. Well, we started this conversation with the Peter Drucker quote where he said, "What gets measured gets managed." And of course, he's correct up to a point. But I think that in the messy real world where people's bonuses or even jobs are dependent on them meeting certain targets, it probably is more accurate to say what gets measured gets manipulated. And I think this illustrates the problem that we see with a lot of existing KPIs and targets, as you've been alluding to, because they often drive the wrong behaviors. Too often, we see people managing the performance indicators, but not managing the performance of their business. Now, I'll try and illustrate this with 3 real-life examples, and these examples are genuinely real. So the first example, targeting 80% of work to be completed in a given time frame, is a very common sort of service level agreement, SLA, KPI, call it what you will. And clearly the emphasis is supposed to be on customer service. And yet for some customers, the reality is exactly the opposite. This is because managers learn that they can't influence the percentage once something has gone beyond the deadline, beyond the 10 days in this case. So they put all their attention into working on work that is just coming up to that deadline. And if it's past the 10 days, then they don't need to do it. So ironically, you can have the effect that the target can be hit while actually failing to deliver good customer service. And I've seen this kind of behavior with this kind of KPI in all kinds of operations, both in the public sector and the private sector. This is not unique to any one kind of organization. Now, the second example is perhaps a simpler one and goes to what we were talking about with quotas. So here we just have a simple example of a staff quota. Now, all too often, this leads to things like cherry picking, where staff look to find the easiest items to process, maybe taking the work out of date order so that they can just find the easy ones, and maybe leaving the difficult ones for colleagues to deal with. Now, under those circumstances, when that gets spotted, this kind of cheating is likely to lead to responses which will further limit the staff discretion or their initiative, even to the point of introducing workflow tools simply to push the next item of work into the staff inbox, so they have no idea what's coming next. Now, of course, that might mechanically solve the problem, but what it actually does is it disempowers and alienates staff, leading them to feel even less motivated to meet the company's targets. And so we're kind of into a downward spiral then. And my final example comes from an outsourced operation that committed to its client that it would process all work on the day it was scanned. And I think you might guess where I'm going with this one. As volumes began to become difficult to cope with because they were variable, senior managers actually issued a requirement that the scanning team should only scan as much as the processing team could cope with. So the report went back to the client saying 100% of scanned work was completed. But I really don't think that's what the client originally had in mind. And of course, because the work was not getting scanned, there were then resulting problems in the traceability of work. Now, these examples might seem odd to this audience, I don't know. But as I've traveled around the world meeting operations managers in many different environments, I think they nearly all have a pretty good idea of what to do to make their month-end or year-end return look good. And this often doesn't actually reflect the actual performance of the operation. So our listeners might like to think about their own way in which they manage some of their performance indicators. And maybe it's human nature, maybe it's inevitable that some KPIs will be manipulated. But I think if we help managers to be better at genuinely managing performance, then they will have less need to manipulate the measures. And by helping them, I mean doing three things. First, empowering them with simple tools to help them better plan and control their work. And not just leaving that to the central planning functions, but involving the teams and their frontline team leaders or supervisors. Then, focusing managers on shared methods so that they all work in the same way and are therefore much more able to pull together. And finally, developing managers' skills in operations management so they have the confidence to manage the operation and let the measures take care of themselves. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Eric, to explain how we can do this differently.
Really appreciate that explanation, Neil. So it's time now to discuss some alternative ways of thinking about key performance parameters. What do we do when we talk about a new paradigm? Well, probably when we say it out loud, it sounds pretty much like common sense. But as the saying goes, that doesn't mean it is common practice. Taken together, we believe that some simple changes can add up to a whole new way of working, a way of working that can deliver not just small increments of improvement, but a major change in performance. the first approach to measuring performance away from did we hit this or that target towards are we continuously improving will start to change everyone's thinking and avoid some of the self-limiting effects often associated with target setting. Next, we have proven that a more flexible and responsive approach to staffing, moving away from just-in-case towards just-in-time, will help you to deliver better service at a lower cost. And finally, moving from a largely top-down control approach to one in which teams have much greater involvement in the day-to-day decision-making will increase agility, improve customer service, and improve the morale and engagement of all employees. Let's break this down a bit in the next few minutes. Earlier, we asked the question, where can I find the rest that I need to fill this glass? What if you could implement an approach where there was no limit to productivity? And we define productivity as the ratio of work output expressed in time divided by the time available to produce it. Given the fact that this is a ratio, why not create measures around the growth of productivity in terms of trend? And similarly, look at cost per unit as a downward trend target. This would be at a team level, not an individual level. Now, take a look at some examples of what this looks like via this real data. What this data represents is multiple teams with disparate work types applying the new paradigm. Every team with different task complexity and skill levels drives the variations in overall performance gain. But note that the average overall gain is well above 15%. So where do you find the productivity lift to fill the glass? You saw this diagram before when we talked about quota-driven KPI. So if demand variation, volatility, and staff allocations could be aligned real-time with incoming volume, then cost will be controlled and resource waste is minimized. Some aha moments need to take place to accomplish this alignment. The first aha moment takes place by looking to balance via cross-team mobilization, which allows you to remove the need for overtime. Here's aha moment number 2. If I balance the resources and minimize cost using active management. And aha moment 3 occurs with team performance goals. Now, productivity and cross-skilling will replace individual quota, which in turn will drive realistic goals the staff can control. So let me bring Fotios in one more time. Fotios, could you comment on your own experiences with this paradigm shift, focused on the metrics in the last few slides?
Sure. Well, Eric, our team managers used to manage productivity to some degree via the quota method, but with no control, we're limited in maintaining a stable productivity. More productivity was measured in different ways by different teams, so there was no consistency, and it was more of a loose term than a common and comparable metric. Under the new paradigm, team managers and senior managers plan and manage volume across teams, so they're not just looking at their own teams. There is a focus across all the teams, and we have a much more stable productivity than the past. We don't work with quotas anymore, and team managers are no longer motivated to protect their turf. Their motivation has shifted towards the betterment of the staff and the organization as a whole. There is far greater collaboration among the teams. In the past, there used to be perceptions that this team is overstaffed while my team is understaffed, etc. And those perceptions are gone. Employees as well. You'd have employees sitting in teams that the team next to them would be working leisurely while they're scrambling to finish their work. It was demotivating. It wasn't really good. In our new world, there is greater transparency and collaboration across the teams. Managers that don't have enough volume are motivated to do something with their resources. Staff that run out of work don't have to pace themselves to look busy. There is great spirit in all of this, and it's very motivating for employees at all levels.
Great. I appreciate your digging a little bit deeper into that for us, Fotios, and I'll come back to you in just a minute. But now, let's discuss the inherent value of team proficiency as opposed to individual performance. Much of what we've discussed to this point focused on KPIs and quotas for the individual. But within the paradigm shift that we've started to discuss, there are a few measures we'd like to talk about. We've already explained the variability in task and skill levels, which will drive short-term productivity variability. This is indicated in this diagram by the short-term variations in productivity shown by the arrow. Generally speaking, employees often feel expectations are unfair and don't take into account skills and task variability. Over time, as individual flexibility and cross-skill mobility is enhanced, you reduce the short-term productivity variations and more importantly, have shown a positive increase in the underlying trend. We've also discussed at length that individual quotas have negative impacts. So what we want you to think about now is team-level goals and accomplishments. Operational control, individual flexibility, and cross-skill mobility are some items we've touched on being enhanced. At this point, we can take this to another level to mobilize the whole organization with the same concepts. Having plans that take into account someone, say, at 40% proficiency and someone else at 80% proficiency, as an example, will give you predictability and control for cross-mobilizing resources. This is where the whole organization balances its excess and shortfalls in resource capacity. Productivity growth will continue to trend upwards, while productivity short-term variations continue to converge. So now, I'd like to spend a little bit more time with Fotios Horatsiotis from National Bank, who can give some additional perspective from his firsthand experience. So, Fotios, if we could, let's start with some basics for everyone. Can you give us a bit of your background and then share with us why National Bank chose to adopt the AOM method?
Sure. Well, I've been with National Bank for 13 years, and I've been in operations for practically my whole career. And I was over at a conference at the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association conference in Florida, where I stumbled upon the AOM booth, and I met Chris Garfield from AOM. And I was intrigued with what Chris had to say and wanted to find out more, and that's where I brought the AOM folks to my organization, and the timing was just right. We were at that time opening up a center of expertise that was going to focus on operational planning and productivity, and the timing was right. We were kind of reinventing the wheel, and AOM seemed to have it all figured out. So we worked closely and we engaged AOM, and we've rolled out the methodology now to about 1,000 employees, and there are another 1,000 that are in the process.
So based on our conversation today, Fotios, can you give us an example of a couple of KPIs that you've used or have used in the past that you now would not use because they don't support the new active management methods?
Yes, our KPIs were mostly on process transaction volume. So the higher the number for a given level of staff, the better. Our KPIs were dependent on an uncontrollable factor, incoming volume. Today we frown upon chasing volume.
Okay, so where would you say your organization is at in its thinking of repurposing some key metrics in order to support the new paradigm?
Well, for one, we measure what we control. It's not the volume that counts, it's what we do with our resources that counts. We're more interested in metrics such as the level of employee proficiency, cross-team mobility, and the loaning and borrowing of staff across the different teams. Productivity, diverted time versus core time, latent capacity, these are all the metrics that we look at today.
So in making the transition to a different way of looking at data, what would be the two top challenges you faced, and how are you going about tackling these challenges?
Well, one of the challenges we faced is that we had a culture of getting everything done before the end of day. Employees expected to start the next day on a clean slate, and the AOM methodology allows and encourages work in progress for certain activities. Getting employees to leave work behind was a pretty big challenge. They just had this thing that I'm leaving the day without completing my work. But with the training and the ongoing coaching that we implemented, our employees were able to see the big picture of how work is prioritized across the operation, not just in their own team. They now understand why it's okay to leave work behind. And they'll even question why we're working on something if it can wait. So this is a real change in behavior. It took some time to get to that, but it is happening that employees are saying, do I really need to do this today? And they're kind of almost demanding that certain work stay behind because they can see what a priority is.
Yeah, that's a great example, Photios. I would imagine some of our listeners might be scratching their head about that one, and I hope they reach out and ask some questions of us. So also, Photios, you head up the wealth management group, but are other areas of National Bank using this approach, and do you know what their overall results have looked like?
Yes, in wealth operations, we've rolled it out to all departments. I have to say there was some reluctance to roll it out in certain teams as they thought, this is not for us. You know, we're not really a production team. It's really for those guys that are doing pure transactions. But we soon learned that it can fit in any operational department. We've rolled it out to personal and commercial banking operations, and we're now in the process of rolling it out to our capital markets group as well. The overall results have been better than projected. This paradigm shift has empowered staff and managers alike. Everyone has a better control and feels more valuable to the organization. The staff have acquired new knowledge and skills, and they have greater mobility between teams, and it opens up job opportunities. There was employees that were uncertain about other teams and would not necessarily apply to jobs, and now that they get a taste through this borrowing and lending process, we have a lot more internal hirings than we had in the past. The team managers have tools and information at their disposal that allows them to allocate staff where they're best suited and considering their skill and proficiency level. Senior managers and VPs have information that gives them a true picture of unit cost and what is driving it up or down. The new paradigm has brought a new language to the organization. Employees at all levels can be heard speaking about lending and borrowing resources, core tasks, diverted tasks, team productivity, etc. This is great to hear when you're walking in the corridors and to hear employees at different levels speaking the AOM lingo.
That's great. Photios, I want to thank you for taking some time to share your experiences with our attendees today. And I'm sure your experiences have helped clarify for them what the outcomes of this paradigm shift look like. So to recap, we've covered a lot of material. And in summary, you've seen that some commonly used indicators don't always give you the best possible performance results. The approaches we've touched upon open a whole new world of possibilities to drive substantial gains at the financial level, at the operating level, and also at the human level. One key takeaway is that absolutes should take a rear seat or maybe even be avoided. I say that due to their intrinsic self-limiting effects. So to reiterate, quotas are volumes. Quotas are budgets. Quotas are a combination of things that are absolutes. Quotas create a mentality amongst staff that does not lead to the best possible. In recapping skill level and task variability, here's another way of thinking about it. These two pictures both require different skills and different times to complete, but they're both pictures, and actually they're both the same picture. But let's look at it in terms of today's discussion. Let's take an example of a claim or a loan. You'll have a team of various skill levels. You'll also have some loans and some claims of different complexities. You can't treat them as being an item that all team members can complete in the same amount of time. This is using active management instead of workforce management. Let's review productivity. It's the pace and efficiency of work output, not a measure of production output or quota. Productivity is the efficiency of using all the resources available within the organization, and it implicitly accounts for the variables in individual skills and day-to-day core task complexity. And productivity trend is inversely correlated to cost per standard unit trend, and both are indicators that together drive significant bottom line benefits. So the real question, Why apply limits? In summary, all of what we've discussed today regarding KPIs is intended to get you thinking about empowering your frontline managers, which is where these measures fit best, to take the reins of decision-making and learn how to respond to issues, opportunities, and to understand the benefits of frontline-driven planning and associated resource balancing. And let me show you what results can look like. This shows actual results from a client where this approach was implemented in an operation of about 1,200 staff. It was deployed sequentially in groups of between 200 and 400 full-time employees. This client has stated that they're en route to an annualized savings of over $8 million from this implementation. I hope you found this presentation useful and educational. Before we go, I'd like to once again thank our special guest, Fotios Aratziotis from National Bank of Canada, for his time and a look at the benefits his organization is finding with this new approach, as well as Neil Bentley, co-founder of AOM International, for his explanation of how this new approach or new paradigm can be significantly impactful to service operations bottom line. If you'd like to get more information about any of the elements we've discussed today, please visit our website at www.activeops.com/NA. Additional contact information is on the screen now, and please note that this webinar will be available for rebroadcast on both the IQPC Process Excellence Network and the Active Operations Management websites. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the near future for another in our series of webinars focusing on improving productivity within service operations. I'm Eric Sharp. Have a great day. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you to our other presenters. Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much to our other presenters, Neil and Fotios. Really great presentation, all of you. And I think a final thank you as well to everyone that's attended today's webinar. I do hope that you found it interesting and informative. That does conclude today's webinar. But as always, don't forget that for more process-related resources, including a full calendar of upcoming webinars, podcasts, articles, and much more, log on to www.pexnetwork.com.